Elvis was walking through the lobby of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis when he heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't the perfect, polished music that usually filled expensive hotel lobbies. It was something broken, struggling, heartbreakingly beautiful. An elderly man with trembling hands was attempting to play an old upright piano in the corner, his fingers fighting against themselves to find the keys they had once known by heart. What Elvis witnessed in that Memphis hotel lobby would lead to one of the most moving musical collaborations of his career and prove that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the places where dreams refuse to die. It was October 3rd, 1972, and Elvis had just finished a meeting with his record label when he decided to walk through the historic Peabody Hotel rather than take his usual direct route to his car. The lobby was bustling with the typical mixture of business travelers and tourists, but something drew Elvis toward the corner where an old upright piano sat largely ignored by the passing crowd. At the piano bench sat an elderly African-American man, probably in his 80s, wearing a worn but carefully pressed suit that had clearly seen better days. His hands, gnarled with age and trembling with what Elvis would later learn was Parkinson's disease, were attempting to play what sounded like a jazz standard. But the melody was fractured, interrupted by pauses where his fingers couldn't find the right keys, by moments where the trembling made it impossible to maintain the rhythm. Most people walking by either didn't notice or politely ignored the struggling performance. A few dropped coins into the small cup beside the piano, more out of pity than appreciation. But Elvis stood transfixed, not by what the man was playing, but by what he was trying to play, the ghost of extraordinary talent that still lived in those failing hands. The elderly man's name was Clarence Professor Washington, though he hadn't been called professor in nearly 10 years. In his prime, he had been one of the most respected jazz pianists in Memphis, playing the clubs on Beale Street when segregation kept black musicians from the mainstream venues, but couldn't keep their music from influencing everyone who heard it. Professor Washington had played with legends, B.B. King, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters when they passed through Memphis. His nimble fingers and sophisticated harmonic sense had made him a sought-after session musician in the 1940s and 50s. He had trained dozens of young musicians, taught them not just how to play, but how to feel music in their souls. But time and illness had been cruel to Professor Washington. The Parkinson's disease that had begun as a slight tremor in his left hand had gradually stolen his ability to do the thing he loved most in the world. His wife had died 3 years earlier, and his small pension barely covered the rent on his tiny apartment. Playing in the hotel lobby for tips was one of the few ways he could still feel connected to music, even though each attempt reminded him of what he had lost. Elvis watched for nearly 10 minutes as Professor Washington struggled through fragments of Autumn Leaves, Body and Soul, and other jazz standards. Despite the technical difficulties, Elvis could hear something extraordinary, a musical intelligence that age and illness couldn't diminish, an understanding of melody and harmony that came from decades of serious study and performance. When Professor Washington finally stopped playing, exhausted from the effort, Elvis approached the piano. The elderly man looked up with eyes that had seen too much struggle but still held dignity and grace. "That was beautiful," Elvis said quietly, kneeling down so he could speak at the professor's eye level. Professor Washington studied Elvis's face for a moment, recognition dawning slowly. "You're Elvis Presley," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated man despite the tremor that affected his speech. "Yes, sir, and you're one hell of a piano player." Professor Washington's laugh was bitter, but not unkind. "Used to be. These hands don't obey me anymore, but I keep trying because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because music is all I know. It's all I am." Elvis felt something twist in his chest. He recognized that desperate need to make music despite obstacles, that fear of losing the thing that defined your very existence. "How long have you been playing?" 70 years. Started when I was 8 years old, played professionally for over 50 years before—" He held up his trembling hands. "Before this." "Would you mind if I sat with you for a minute?" Elvis asked. Professor Washington nodded. Moving over slightly on the piano bench, Elvis sat down and placed his hands gently on the keys. "What would you like to hear?" Do you know any Art Tatum? Elvis smiled. Art Tatum was a legendary jazz pianist, known for his incredible technical virtuosity and harmonic sophistication. I know some, but I'd rather hear what you want to play. Can you guide me through something? What happened next was like watching two musical souls connect across generations and genres. Professor Washington began to hum Sweet Georgia Brown, his voice still strong and sure, even when his hands betrayed him. Elvis listened carefully, then began to play the melody, looking to the professor for guidance. No, Professor Washington said gently. You're playing it too straight. Jazz isn't about hitting the right notes. It's about the notes you don't hit. Try this. He hummed a variation, adding subtle rhythmic shifts and harmonic embellishments that transformed the simple melody into something sophisticated and alive. Elvis tried to follow, his rock and roll sensibilities stretching to accommodate the complex jazz harmonies. It wasn't perfect, but something magical was happening. The professor's musical knowledge was flowing through Elvis's still capable hands. "That's it," Professor Washington exclaimed, his face lighting up with joy. "You feel it now. Music isn't about perfect execution, it's about perfect communication." They played together for another 20 minutes, the professor humming and guiding, while Elvis provided the physical capability to bring the music to life. Hotel guests began to gather, drawn by the unusual collaboration between the famous entertainer and the elderly jazz master. As they played, Professor Washington began to tell Elvis his story. He spoke of the golden age of Beale Street, of playing until dawn in smoky clubs where the music was pure and powerful. He talked about the young musicians he had taught, many of whom had gone on to successful careers while he remained in the shadows. "I never minded not being famous," he said during a pause between songs. "Fame wasn't the point, the music was the point. But now," his hands trembled more visibly, "now I can't make the music anymore, and I don't know who I am without it." Elvis understood that feeling more than Professor Washington could know. The pressure of fame, the fear of losing his abilities, the terror of facing a world where he couldn't do the thing that defined him. These were fears that kept Elvis awake at night. "Professor," Elvis said quietly, "what if I told you that you could still make music? What if we found a way? I appreciate the kindness, son, but these hands are finished. The doctors say it's only going to get worse. But your mind isn't finished. Your musical knowledge isn't finished. What if we work together? What if you could teach me, really teach me, and we could create something together?" Professor Washington looked at Elvis with surprise and something that might have been hope. "You'd want to learn from an old man like me?" "Sir, I've been playing music professionally for nearly 20 years, and in the last 20 minutes, you've taught me more about music than I learned in the previous month. Yes, I'd want to learn from you." Elvis made a decision that surprised even himself. "Professor, would you be willing to come to my recording studio? Not to perform, but to teach, to help me understand music the way you understand it?" "You're serious?" "Dead serious. I'll send a car for you tomorrow if you're willing." Professor Washington was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'd be honored." The next day, Professor Washington arrived at Elvis's private studio, nervous but excited. Elvis had arranged for a full session with some of Nashville's best musicians, not to record Professor Washington struggling with his failing hands, but to capture his musical wisdom through collaborative performance. "Gentlemen," Elvis told the assembled musicians, "I want you to meet Professor Clarence Washington. He's forgotten more about music than most of us will ever learn, and today he's going to teach us something." What followed was unlike any recording session any of them had ever experienced. Professor Washington would hum a melody, describe a harmonic progression, or explain a rhythmic concept. Elvis and the other musicians would then attempt to translate his ideas into sound, with the professor guiding and refining their interpretation. They worked on 3 songs: "Summertime," "Mood Indigo," and an original composition that emerged from Professor Washington's humming, a blues-influenced ballad that he had been working on in his head for years but had never been able to get his hands to play. The magic happened during the recording of the original piece, which they titled Memphis Twilight. Professor Washington began to hum a melody that seemed to contain all the joy and sorrow of a lifetime in music. As Elvis and the band began to follow his lead, Something extraordinary occurred. The professor's trembling hands began to move toward the piano keys. "I want to try," he whispered. Elvis immediately moved away from the piano bench. Professor Washington sat down, placed his shaking hands on the keys, and began to play. The notes weren't technically perfect. The tremor was still there. The timing wasn't precise. But the emotion, the musical intelligence, the pure soul that came through those struggling fingers created something more beautiful than technical perfection ever could. The other musicians played softly behind him, supporting rather than overwhelming his delicate performance. Elvis hummed harmony, adding his voice to the professor's piano in a collaboration that bridged generations and musical styles. When they finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the studio. Professor Washington sat at the piano, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't think I'd ever make real music again," he whispered. "Professor," Elvis said, "that was the most real music I've ever been part of." The session continued for 3 hours. They recorded 5 complete songs, each one a collaboration between Elvis's voice and stage presence and Professor Washington's deep musical knowledge. But more than that, they had created something neither could have achieved alone, music that honored both the sophistication of jazz and the accessibility of popular music. The album they recorded that day, titled Lessons from the Professor, was initially intended as a private project, something just for them to cherish. But when Elvis played it for friends and industry colleagues, everyone insisted it had to be shared with the world. The album was released 6 months later, with all proceeds going to the Memphis Music Education Foundation, which Professor Washington helped establish to provide music lessons for underprivileged children. The collaboration introduced thousands of Elvis fans to sophisticated jazz concepts, while bringing Professor Washington's musical wisdom to a wider audience than he had ever imagined. More importantly for both men, their weekly sessions continued for the next 2 years. Every Tuesday, Professor Washington would come to the studio, and he and Elvis would explore music together, sometimes recording, sometimes just playing, always learning from each other. "You gave me back my purpose," Professor Washington told Elvis during one of their last sessions together. "I thought I was finished when I could no longer play the way I used to. But you showed me that there are different ways to make music, different ways to share what you know." Elvis, who had been struggling with his own fears about aging and losing his abilities, found equal value in their collaboration. "Professor, you taught me that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. You taught me that experience and wisdom matter more than technical flash." When Professor Washington passed away peacefully in his sleep in December 1974, Elvis was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. The service was held at a small church on the south side of Memphis, and Elvis sang "Memphis Twilight" as a tribute to his friend and teacher. Among Professor Washington's possessions, his family found dozens of musical arrangements he had written out in careful notation, songs he had been unable to play but had continued to compose in his mind. Elvis arranged for these compositions to be professionally recorded by jazz musicians, ensuring that Professor Washington's musical legacy lived on. The Clarence Professor Washington Memorial Piano sits today in the lobby of the Memphis Music Museum. The plaque beneath it reads, "Music has no age, no limitations, only the desire to connect one heart to another." A gift from Elvis Presley in memory of a teacher who showed him that wisdom is the most beautiful music of all. The story of Elvis and Professor Washington reminds us that mentorship can flow in both directions, that age and illness cannot diminish the value of accumulated wisdom, and that sometimes the most beautiful collaborations happen between people who seem to have nothing in common but a shared love of music. Elvis often said that his sessions with Professor Washington were among the most meaningful musical experiences of his career. Not because they produced hit records or sold millions of copies, but because they reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, for its power to connect people across all boundaries and to give voice to the deepest truths of the human experience. In a career filled with spectacular performances and historic achievements, Elvis treasured the memory of sitting at a piano bench with an elderly man whose hands could barely find the keys, but whose musical soul remained as vibrant and powerful as it had ever been. Sometimes the greatest teachers come to us when we least expect them, And sometimes the most important lessons have nothing to do with success and everything to do with the courage to keep making music, no matter what obstacles stand in our way.